In hour 20, we come to yet another masterpiece in tragedy, but we're moving to a very different kind of author. This is Euripides. We're now leaving Sophocles, who could be considered the perfect classic form. Euripides is almost post-classical in the sense that he is so interested in anthropological dimensions of myth and ritual. He is very modern in that way. If I could be impressionistic here for a moment, if I were to say that, let's say, Aeschylus will, in any given tragedy, handle maybe 2 or 3 versions of a myth, and I would say if Sophocles, by comparison, would be ready to handle 5 or 6, then I'd also say that Euripides, in a similar situation, could handle hundreds of them. It's because he went out of his way to collect different versions of different myths and the rituals that go with them. And his Hippolytus is Exhibit A. The way the story is retold here is very local. It has a lot of local color, and that makes it even more interesting for people who study ancient Greek religion as a interaction of myth and ritual. Right from the start, the way Hippolytus is praying to Artemis. There are so many things going on here, and these things are expressed in such a precise way, the precise way that Greek language can be when addressing details of myth and ritual. These are not vague meditations on what it is to worship a goddess. The wording here is programmatically accurate. And we can see that when we compare similar wording in similar situations in our previous reading experience. So even more than before, I urge you to read the text very carefully, to pay attention to how the ancient Greek words are used. And I've given so many of these words in transliteration in the original Greek so you can see how they work in context. What a text here having to do with the religiosity of a figure, not a figure in the everyday life of the historical period of Euripides, but the way a hero in the heroic age would be experimenting with these words at a time when the worship of heroes supposedly hasn't yet happened, and the worship of gods was supposedly different. So there's an interesting mix of the understanding of the religiosity of people who worship heroes in the historical period of Euripides, and how the heroes talk about themselves back in the heroic age, not knowing fully what's going to happen to them, and how one day they will be worshipped as cult heroes. And in our 20 text B, even something that we moderns would consider something spontaneous that just happens to people is rethought as a very programmed way for a larger-than-life person to go through larger-than-life experiences in life, which will be a great lesson for generations in the future and the post-heroic age, but which for them is just a set of uncontrollable emotions that seem to carry them from one crisis to another. And Hippolytus certainly is trying to do the right thing. Here he is trying to be initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. And you already see myth and ritual in play, but things don't seem to be working. They're not working. They are not working the way they will be working in the post-heroic age. And in our 20 text C, you have a perfect example of what we can call an etiology. That is to say, a situation where in the post-heroic age, we have a myth that explains why we have such and such a ritual. And that ritual goes back to some primordial event where something went wrong, very wrong. It may have been something beautiful in its wrongness, but it was wrong. And then somehow, if you go from that primordial event to the here and now, if you go from the myth back there to the ritual here, and everything gets worked out, provided we keep doing that ritual forever. Not so much we ourselves, but we and the people who come after us. But here we already see the story of Hippolytus before the story even comes to its completion. I indulge myself in our 20 text D to show you what the great traveler Pausanias actually says about the myth of Hippolytus and Phaedra. And here you get details from the local color of the myth as it was told in the place called Trozen. And the details for me are even more fascinating than the more general observations about the passion of the given heroes and how they resisted or caved in to these passions. In our 20 text E, I pursue the observations of Pausanias. And what I like about the way this traveler describes myths and rituals as he observed them in the 2nd century CE, so half a millennium after the composition of the Hippolytus as we know it. The accuracy of the words in referring to the myths and rituals, these words as used by Pausanias, are stunningly parallel to the accuracy of parallel words that are used in the tragedy of Euripides. So sometimes you might get impatient with me that I keep coming back to the words and how the words refer to the ideas behind the myths and the rituals. But frankly, it's the precision of these words and the precision of the system that is reflected by these words that makes the study, I think, so worthwhile and makes it so appealing for us when we really get to understand what's going on in the myth and the ritual simply by looking at the words very carefully and connecting the dots. In our 20 text F, I give you examples where even those areas of the Hippolytus myth that are not central, or at least don't seem central to the tragedy as we know it, turn out to be relevant, showing sometimes sidelights that make us understand even better what's going on in the heroic world of Hippolytus and Phaedra. And the idea that Artemis has the epithet of Artemis of the Wolves, which seems at first to be not relevant, may turn out to be quite relevant if we look at the bigger picture of what Hippolytus is all about in the myths and rituals of the Greek-speaking world at large. In our 20 text G, we see that if we understand the myths and rituals of Hippolytus, we may also get to understand better some other myths and rituals that don't seem directly relevant, like the myths and rituals surrounding the cult hero Asklepios, who exceptionally gets to be more and more like a god and less like a cult hero with the passage of history. This Asklepios will have a very big role when we get to our 23, a moment when Plato's Socrates, just before he dies, says, "Don't forget to sacrifice a rooster to Asklepios." And could I tell you, it's not an easy thing to figure out. A lot of professional philosophers haven't figured it out. And I'm suggesting that if you understand what's going on here at hour 20, text G, with the references here to Asklepios and how Asklepios supposedly resurrected Hippolytus after Hippolytus dies, you may have, I think, an advantage in understanding what Socrates says in Plato's Phaedo when he makes that remark, don't forget to sacrifice a rooster to Asklepios. So hold that in mind as we keep reading on. In hour 20, text H, we get to a central moment in the myths and the rituals surrounding Hippolytus and Phaedra. And first I give a prosaic version. This is the way Pausanias, the traveler from the 2nd century CE, describes the ritual. And it has to do with cutting of hair. It has to do with singing of laments. Laments for whom? Laments for Hippolytus. And I don't want to give it away, but I think you're in for a treat when you see how this prosaic account matches something that we will read in the tragedy itself about the myths and the rituals of Hippolytus in the historical world. And with that, I come to hour 20, text I. Maybe it's my favorite of all texts that I give you. I might regret saying it quite that way, but I do love this passage so much because it shows how Euripides is not just a great poet, but a great anthropologist. What we're getting here is a description of the ritual in honor of Hippolytus as a cult hero, as performed by young women who are being initiated from girlhood into womanhood. It just doesn't get better than this for me because the language, again, is so precise. And all along, I've been giving you the original Greek words in square brackets so you could see how these words are used and how precise and accurate they are in referring to the myths and rituals of cult heroes. Everything is here, and the words that we've been studying from the very beginning of our project are coming back here with renewed life and with renewed accuracy of reference. You really see, for example, that penthos is not just sorrow, it's sorrow as expressed by singing and dancing, in this case by a group of young women who are being initiated from girlhood to womanhood. And first you read a prose description, now you see the poetic realization in a ritual context. It really is a perfect coming together for me of everything we're trying to accomplish in coming to terms with the idea of the ancient Greek hero. And it gets better, if that's possible, in our 20 text J, because if I'm right, what young women sing as they're being initiated from girlhood into womanhood in this remote community of Trozen, as studied and poeticized by Euripides in his Hippolytus. What you get in this choral passage that I quote for you in text J is, I think, the actual content of what these young women would be singing and dancing. In other words, in this choral passage that I quote for you here, the women of Trozen are actually singing and dancing about the unrequited love of Phaedra, a love that they haven't figured out yet. But I would suggest, in fact, I'll argue that the kind of song that is being sung here is precisely the kind of song that would be performed in real life by young women who are actually being initiated into the mysteries of the cult hero Hippolytus and the cult hero Phaedra, who so desperately loved him at the cost of her life and at the cost of his own life. The psychology of the love of Phaedra for Hippolytus is expressed in a way that's deeply personal, as we see in our 20 text K. But this personal expression is at the same time most accurate, again from the point of view of myth and ritual. Everything that Phaedra says to her confidante, whom we generically call the nurse, is beautiful escapist poetry, but at the same time, it's also ritually and mythologically accurate. There is this yearning to be in the world of Artemis, a world that involves hunting and athletics for men, both off limits for women, mortal women, but definitely something that is nurtured for men. And the only way that somebody like Phaedra, who wants to be a part of the life of Hippolytus, to imagine all this is to project herself into the position of the goddess Artemis herself, because even though mortal women can't engage in athletics and cannot hunt the way young men do, certainly Artemis not only can do it, but is the model for doing it, even though she's female. There's a great deal of inequity here between what goddesses can do and what mortal women can do. That makes it, I think, not just tragic to read what Phaedra is saying, but also beautiful. It's a beautiful statement of human longing, and I find it simultaneously beautiful and, as I'm saying in so many different ways, accurate. Even the death of Phaedra, which is described in loving detail in our 20 text L, is a perfect statement of the world of the cult hero. The escapist fantasy of taking off and soaring over the most beautiful places in the earth. This exercise in looking at the beauties of the world is presented in a context where, when I say that the death of Phaedra is described accurately, yes, it's described accurately, but from the point of view of her mental state, not necessarily the physical procedure of how she kills herself. And I find that the way this is done here is, again, not only great poetry, as great as it gets, but also a most accurate blueprint for how worshippers of cult heroes can actually connect with the larger-than-life experiences of those cult heroes and bring them into their own lives in the context of rituals where there is singing and dancing that reenacts these larger-than-life experiences.